Okay, what we're going to do today is just round off the course summarizing the kind of main sequence of changes, political and maybe reference to some other changes that we've seen in the past 3 months or so. And then I shall give you back your draft essays with some comments and suggestions and so on, for those of you who are here, obviously. Let's make a start then. So, we began all those many months ago in the dark and distant past, and we were all much younger and fitter and so on, looking at, well, in fact, Roman but pre-Roman Britain. And here is presumably a map I showed at the time, showing the main, what we would call perhaps tribal groups, population groups, which we know from Britain at the time, described in Roman sources and so on. This doesn't show a similar kind of patchwork of tribes that existed in Ireland at the same time, but it was the same kind of pattern. So each tribe obviously had a kind of fluctuating border and identity and so on, and some names recur regularly, other names disappear quite regularly and so on from the accounts and so on, but the main pattern is this breakdown of separate tribes and so on. And obviously we're not talking about any great political unity here, if we can talk about any kind of unity at all, a degree of cultural and linguistic unity, I suppose. Then along comes Emperor Claudius. Wait a minute, I need to have this done. Make this slightly larger. And we see the incorporation of a large part of Britain, not the whole of it by any means, but a large part of Britain into the Roman Empire. And during the course of the 1st and 2nd century, we see the spread of Romanitas, Romanization, into Britain. The old tribal units are organized or provide the basis for what we called a kind of administrative division into civitas, usually based at a civitas capital there, okay, so there's some kind of degree of organization. And the main big division was between the southern lowland civil zone and then the more military zone, which incorporates North Wales and a large part of what is now England, and obviously then when you get beyond Hadrian's Wall, briefly for a while, Antonine Wall, you're into a separate area that was not part of Rome. And again, Ireland remains outside of that. Okay, you don't get Roman conquest there. So for this area, and then to some extent up to here as well, okay, part of the Roman world, which brings along with it all the things which being part of the Roman world involved. Ultimately, of course, Christianity, but literacy and Roman way of life and so on, and a degree of political unity. As we did see, you see a number of stages where the Roman Britain was broken up into separate provinces. Originally 1, then we see 2, and then later 4 provinces, okay, but still part of the Roman world. Then things kind of begin to fall apart. The end of independent Roman rule. The Romans leave effectively, and in the southern and eastern parts of Britain, we see the arrival of Germanic-speaking peoples from the continent, the Angles and Saxons. Okay, and that grey area there indicates roughly their region of settlement, they think, by about the year 500. I came up with a kind of annotated version of that here. Okay, oh no, I need to do this, which shows the same kind of story, but perhaps a little bit more clear. Though I think the two, the red and the green, showing the difference between the Saxon and Angle regions. I'm not so concerned about that. But during this period as well, particularly into the 6th and 7th century, we see the emergence in what is now England, Angleland, of a series of, not including here, a series of what become kingdoms, okay, which are considered to be English, though presumably have some Celtic origin. And in the west and the north, we see the emergence of similar kingdoms as well. So we see a breakup of political unity into something very similar to what was going on before the Roman conquest. And in Ireland during the same time, many of the old tribes disappear and we see the emergence of new political units. These are just the main provinces over kingdoms that we talked about. Underneath those we saw lots of smaller kingdoms and dynastic groups as well. So a high degree of kind of political fragmentation. And this is the picture during the what we call the very early medieval period, the Dark Ages or whatever. Same. Yeah, go on.
Did the Roman rule in Britain collapse because of the invasion of the Angles and Saxons, or they lived by their own wish? They leave the island by their own. That's a good.
Can anyone cast their minds back 2 months? Yeah. Can anyone answer Altai's question?
I think they leave to protect the motherland, and then the migrants.
Yes. I mean, in the old days, people used to say that the barbarians, in this case, of course, the Angles and Saxons, but on the continent we talk about the Franks and Ostrogoths and so on. It was traditional to see somehow the barbarians as the reason for the collapse of the Roman Empire, that they came in and smashed it. But nowadays, most people would say, no, there were internal problems of various sorts, political, economic and others, which led the Roman Empire to kind of begin to shrink first, which is why Britain gets kind of left behind, and then begin to collapse. And then it's into that vacuum or problem area that the barbarians come. So the barbarians came in because the Roman Empire was kind of collapsing anyway. And in the case of Britain, we get accounts from the 4th and early 5th century of kind of Romans leaving, okay, and pulling away legions because they have, it's obviously Britain's on the edge of the Roman world, it's not very important. And it's because of the defences are breaking down that Anglo-Saxon groups, many of them already there, but part of the Roman world at that point as kind of mercenaries begin to form their own identity. So they're not the cause, they're part of the problem, but they're more a symptom rather than a cause, we would perhaps think. And while they're coming in, which is these arrows here, we also said we have a number of other movements. People from, Celtic British people from the south of what is now England, migrating across to northwest France, becoming Brittany, okay? And they still speak Breton in parts, the western parts of Brittany, which is the British language. From Ireland, we see some movement in this direction, but that doesn't lead to very much in the long term. But also from the north of Ireland, around Ulster, we see the settlement in this area, and the creation you can't read it here, but the kingdom of Dalriada emerges there, and that's the origin of what becomes the kingdom of the Scots. Okay, before then we have lots of different kingdoms with the Picts in the north, and then some British kingdoms in the southern part as well. And that's more or less indicated again on this map that we have here. So the same kind of very broad sweep of names for Ireland, and we see the various Anglo and Saxon groups, the Welsh kingdoms named, and here round about the year 700 the expected border of the kingdom of Dalriada, which is being set up by these Gaelic Irish settlers here. Then, as we move into the 8th and then 9th century, we see the arrival of the Vikings, a new group or groups of people from Scandinavia, okay, active throughout Europe and beyond. And in the case of Britain, we saw a number of patterns. First, of course, they're raiding, they're attacking rich and often ecclesiastical sites, but then the gradual settlement, conquest and settlement of large parts of Britain, particularly of England and northern parts of what's in the process of becoming Scotland, okay, and then we have an additional political, socio-political element in the form of these Scandinavian kingdoms. Gradually, all the English, all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were destroyed by Viking armies. Something kind of vaguely independent carries on in the north, okay, in Northumbria, but basically it's only Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons under Alfred the Great, which is able to resist Viking pressure. They form this little boundary here, okay? Anything to the east and north of that is kind of effectively given to the Vikings. So from the 9th and into the 10th century, we have kind of independent England down here. We have Viking kingdoms and control along here, okay? And around about the same time, we see the beginning of the process of the Gaelic kingdoms here expanding and taking over Pictland and creating what becomes the kingdom of the Scots, okay? So the beginning of some kind of unity up here. What happens is that the successors of Wessex gradually in the 10th century reconquer the rest of what is now England, but instead of breaking it up into separate little kingdoms, remember, they then create one kingdom which becomes the kingdom of the English, the kingdom of England, okay? So then we have a picture, England as a unity. We still have Strathclyde perhaps surviving in some form up here, but disappearing under pressure from the new kingdom of the Scots. So we have the Scots, the English, the Welsh carry on as separate little kingdoms at this time, as do the Irish. Then, 1066, here come the Normans. And following the Normans, the emergence, particularly under Henry II, of what we call the Angevin Empire. Firstly, the Duke of Normandy, who has certain powers in other parts of northern France, but effectively the Duke of Normandy becomes King of England. Okay, that's the first big thing. Then we see the additional the expansion of the Duke of Normandy in England and King of England's powers to a large part of France through marriages and connections and so on. So, as we said, the King of France limited to direct power here, and this very powerful vassal controlling right from the north of France down to the south. Meanwhile, the Normans begin to penetrate into Wales. Okay, earlier on, under the early Normans, we see the conquest of the border region and parts of South Wales, okay, under William the Conqueror and William II, William Rufus. So that independent Welsh Wales is kind of becoming more limited there. Okay, those kingdoms still there. Then also under Henry, 1169 and then 1171, we get the beginning of Norman involvement in Ireland as well. Again, partly independent Norman lords, so not kind of the king, but eventually the king gets involved, Henry gets involved as well, and this kind of expands through a series of conquests so that we get an expansion of power. But here's one snapshot, in a sense, of Anglo-Norman power. England, bits of Wales, kind of indirectly, bits of Wales and Normandy, Ireland, and then Normandy south in France as well. That's the kind of biggest picture that we can present. Under John, of course, things fall apart. Normandy and other French territories are lost. Only in the south do the English kings continue to claim and have some direct power. Okay, England still quite strong, effectively. And here is another map, not such a good one, I should add, showing the situation. So here we have Kingdom of England, clearly marked. Okay, this is the beginning of the 13th century. Scotland, separate kingdom. Wales, we have kind of these areas under Welsh control. Then we have the Norman marches and lordships down here. And I don't know how clear that is. We can see some regions still under Irish control, but all these areas here increasingly under the control of what we are calling Normans in that sense. Just to finish off, for Wales, as we said last time, under Edward I, we finally see the end of any Welsh independence. Okay, these areas still Marcher lordships, but of course part of kind of the English situation. But then we get the creation, following the conquest of Gwynedd and so on, of new shires, new counties under royal rule in Wales. So independent Welsh rule disappears. Again, a mixture of these things. And for Ireland, around about 1300, where we finish off our survey, okay, you can see the regions held by what you might call Anglo-Norman or Anglo-Irish at this point, lords and so on here, and then pockets of Irish independence, the green areas there. Okay, this is again a map which will change depending when you look at it, but it shows us that situation. So we've seen shifts in political and cultural patterns, okay, over time, periods of significant political unity under the Roman Empire, followed by periods of kind of disunity, and then later, as we move into the later Middle Ages, the gradual spread of more power and unity as well. Okay, the process obviously continues in the later Middle Ages and early modern period. Okay, so that was just a brief summary of what we've been looking at for the past 3 months. Any kind of questions, any points, any comments? No? Okay. Okay, let's finish today, because I'm not lecturing a lot today, but I'll give you your draft essays back with some comments and so on. Firstly, let's remind ourselves the last day for submitting grades is 15th of January. And I have said 11th of January for the final versions, okay, for the very, very final essay. You can bring them to the library, you can bring them and put them under my history door, you can send as an email, whatever it is, as long as I get them by that time. Of course, I'm a little bit flexible, but as I said, if everyone says, oh, he's flexible, I'll send my essay on the 14th or something, and then I've suddenly got a lot to do in the next 24 hours, in addition to other things I've got to do during that time, and it will be probably physically impossible to read all your essays properly and then calculate the final grade. So that's why I'm saying, please do your best to give them by the 11th. If there is a problem, and I understand that you have many things to do, you have many works to do, if you really have a problem with that deadline, or if the work you will give to me is kind of insufficient for getting a good grade, in your opinion, then we can negotiate an incomplete grade, okay? I can, on the 15th of January, when I put the grades up, I can give you I incomplete, and that will give you, well, I think it's technically 2 weeks, but I would say 1 extra week to be on the safe side, to give me the work. Then I fill in a form and change the I to whatever grade you finally deserve, okay? But I would warn you to try and avoid that if possible. Last time I taught this course, one student failed to give his essay in, and it became F, and that was the end of that. Okay, you can change the F, but he didn't give any work to me to allow me to do that. So please negotiate quite carefully with me and let me see what you've got and so on, so that we make sure that doesn't happen to you. Okay, is that all clear? Yes? Right, so essays, for those of you who are here, let me see, the top of the pile is Azra, okay? And yes, we talked about this kind of very broad topic and so on, which is basically, it says okay here. Perhaps at times you need to go into a bit more detail, okay, focus in on certain issues. When you've got a very, very big topic that covers, well, in theory, everything, of course, and then covers kind of over 1,000 years, you can't do everything. So one of the tricks you can do in this kind of study, in my opinion, is you can make a lot of general comments and try and show you're aware of most things, and then maybe take 1 or 2 examples to look at them in more detail, to then say, okay, I can't talk about everything unless I write a whole book, but I can look at 1 or 2 things in a little bit more detail. So in 1 or 2 cases you might consider going into more detail. I've scribbled a few comments on here. Let me see. These are just questioning your points, but if I've written in capitals, that tells me, okay, what have I got? Here, or elsewhere. Okay, yes, when you're discussing what seems to be kind of economy and agriculture and so on early on, I think also, and then you move into urbanism and towns, something perhaps relating to settlement might be interesting, in settlement patterns, maybe what place names show and so on. I used the books by Margaret Gelling, we have a few in the library.
I will talk about place names.
Yeah, that, as a way of showing, because obviously if new people come in and take over, if they use the old names, there's some kind of continuity. You remember I said, I can't remember if it was the Vikings or the Romans, if you come in and kill everyone and say, let's live here, what's it called, but you're all dead, then I give it a new name. But if I use the same name that you've been using, it means we've had some kind of interaction beyond just killing and so on. So, I mean, that's a very, very kind of simplified way of putting it. But so names can tell us a certain degree about shifts and things like that of population, which may not refer to culture, but you need to think about that. What have I got here? Okay. When you're talking about Christianity, then you lead into what you call language and culture, which I think we could talk about more broadly, literacy in a very big way, okay? I think this can be expanded, okay? And you need then to move into, you need to move forward into literature and literacy in the later Middle Ages as well, which you do in other places for that comparison. And my final big comment, okay, for all of these, in a way, you kind of think of the mechanics. In some cases, say, as you mentioned with towns, there was some kind of continuity. Okay, the same town which existed, or small settlement existed in the Roman period, and clearly from historical or archaeological evidence, we can see that there was some occupation carrying on. Even if culturally or whatever, it's not a proper town or whatever it might be, it carries on. And then in the later Middle Ages, Central Middle Ages, it begins to expand again. So you can talk about some kind of continuity. In other cases, many things which we would associate with the Roman world were reintroduced from the continent. Okay? So for example, Celtic Christianity can be traced back to the Roman world, I mean to the Roman times, okay, to the Roman Britain in a sense, though it had influences from outside as well. Whereas the English got their Christianity from a papal mission sent by Pope Gregory, okay, so that was not something that, although ultimately it's Roman, okay, it was coming from post-Roman Rome rather than something coming from Roman Britain. So,
I can also talk about
so you can, yeah, well not that specifically, I'm saying the mechanics. In looking at these questions, some things were continuous. They may have gone down and then gone up, but they were continuous from Roman Britain to early medieval Britain to later medieval Britain. Some things perhaps disappeared and then in a different form were reintroduced later on. Okay. Yes, yes. So you need to look at the mechanics of how these things were involved and so on. What extent is it Roman Britain rather than just Roman, which is the key in a sense. Okay, so various little things to think about, but I mean the main essay is fine. Okay. Right, who we got here? Fatty's not here. Altai, this is you. Is it Edward I? Is that right? Yeah, because there was no name, but I, by a process of remembering and elimination, I worked it out. Yes, yes. Right. Yeah. Just to remind you all, because okay, a number of cases, Azra included. I had kind of up to 9-10 pages or so, but in other cases I had 2 or 3 pages, which obviously doesn't constitute a final essay. We need something in the region of kind of 10 pages at least, okay, to have covered your topics sufficiently. So what have I got here? So obviously I haven't got lots to write because it's kind of short anyway, but okay, I think in your case, okay, although I have written a lot here, so I better read this. I've got a suggested plan. I'll go back to that in a minute, okay? I think you need to consider what you're saying in your question, what you think the parts of the question mean, okay? Your question as you phrased it here, how did Edward I's efforts, we might change that word, but that's not a big problem, influence the emergence of the Scottish independence movement, okay?
What I mean is the resistance and the becoming a, how can I say, the different entity and the...
Yes. I mean, on a very, very simple level, until you have Scottish dependence, until and really for the first time that happens under Edward, until you actually have someone else controlling Scotland from outside, you can't have an independence movement because there's nothing to be trying to independent from. So we might need to clarify or come up with a slightly more specific way of framing this question, okay, and things like that. The topic itself is fine. I mean, basically looking at the influence of or the role of Edward in terms of Scottish politics and what goes on and so on, like that kind of thing. But we need to think a little bit more. And it's always very good, I say this to all of you, if you have a question or a problem, at the beginning of the essay, it's often very good to just kind of clarify and discuss the points, the main words, the ideas of your question. Make sure you're showing the reader that that he or she can understand what you're trying to do in a sense. Okay. And if I've asked you a question, I need to see if you can understand my question. In this case, you've all framed your own problems, but some kind of a discussion of what it's trying to do, clarify it, is good. Okay. I know that I think it's Turkish high schools, there is this almost a rule, I think, of having a little title, okay, just something there. And I have students who, even in exams, feel they have to write, you know, Edward the First or something a bit snappy and things like that or whatever. Now, that, obviously, I'm not concerned about that. That doesn't. It's the question that is the important thing, the problem, and you mention this and discuss this in your introduction, okay. And then, yes, where you've got, okay, we've got 2 pages, you've got this thing that says to sum up, but then I don't see the word Scotland mentioned at all there. It's all to do with parliaments and things like that. So that suddenly, it seems to me like you're writing about Edward in general. So you'll definitely need to kind of work on that. So I've given you a suggested plan here. I've been a bit generous. I must have been feeling generous at that point. Okay, introduction, discuss your problem or question. We just said that. Then the kind of background to the Scottish issue, the great cause as it's known, which is perhaps saying a little bit about the situation in Scotland before Edward got involved. Not immediately, but in general, what was the situation in Scotland and so on. Then Edward and Scotland we move into, okay, and here there's a background, the succession dispute. You need to tell me what was going on, why did he need to get involved and so on, in a bit more detail. Then we need to look at what he was doing, thinking a little bit about his motivation, what was motivating him, what was his plan, did he have it, and did it change over time and so on. And I think we discussed this when we had the presentation on this topic. And then you can perhaps look at the results, what did he achieve or not achieve, taking it down if you want to 1314, Bannockburn, something like that. Then you've got a little section here where you mention Wales, kind of a bit early, and I was saying, why have you got Wales here? If you want to make a comparison with Wales, it might come later. Section 4, and then you need your conclusion, obviously. So those are my suggestions for you, and you can...
What do you think about the question on my thesis? Can I use and continue to develop over this, the main question?
Yeah, the overall problem is fine. I think we need to phrase the question a bit more specifically, or whatever, or more clearly, or something like that. As I said, in terms of we've seen Scotland as an independent unit, we just saw then, for over 1,000 years, in a sense. Sometimes lots of kingdoms, eventually one kingdom. And until Edward comes along and starts to get involved, you can't talk about an independence movement because there's nothing to try and break away from. So yeah, I mean, yeah, or something. I mean, and with this question, you need to decide, are you focusing on Edward or are you focusing on what the Scots are doing? And that will give you a different question away. If you want to focus on what you're calling the independence movement, whether it's Wallace or Robert the Bruce or something, then you need to focus on those guys, and your question needs to say, this is what I'm talking about. If it's Edward's role, what he's doing, then you need to focus on him or put them together, okay? But in any case, if you still want to send me a later version before the 11th of January, any of you can do that as well. Yeah, okay, and I can give you some comments by email or something like that. Chara. This is kind of embarrassing, being videoed, my comments about your work on video. This is my final chance to be nasty to everyone. No, let me see. Okay, Vikings again, okay. What have I got written here? Main comment at the end. Okay, I'll come to that shortly. Okay, one of the big points that I tried to make in the class when we looked at the Vikings with reference to the raiding versus trading question, which is what you're looking at in your paper, one of the big points I tried to make was that the traditional image, which has dominated history writing since the time of the Vikings, I suppose, that they are kind of violent guys, and continued even into modern history writing until kind of 40 years ago or so, has been created by the fact that the people writing about the Vikings at that time were not the Vikings, because they were not literate or they didn't write things down in Latin and so on, but they are being written about in the later 8th, 9th, 10th century primarily by people in churches. And what are they raiding? What are they attacking? They're attacking churches. And so a big point you need to address, and it should be in the book somewhere, and most of these books are fairly, and sources you've used are relatively up to date, is that the image of them as kind of violent raiders is true. They did do that, but perhaps it's kind of too balanced that way, too focused in that direction, because that's what the priests in these churches were experiencing. So the priests were not seeing the Vikings as tourists traveling to North America or traders or whatever it might be. Their experience of these guys primarily was as violent men who were stealing and killing them and stealing things from them. So I think we would need to consider that question. You need to consider that question. You can disagree. I mean, you don't have to agree. And there's some people these days are saying we've gone too far in this kind of political correct approach and so on, and that we should obviously stress their violent side as well. I can see you're trying to get a balance of things, and you're trying to see how things develop, and you're saying that raiding comes before trading. You should also think about the overall picture of their activity. We see first Vikings as raiders in general, and then later on they're still raiding up to a point, but they're also doing other things. So there is a kind of broad chronological division. So I think you need to consider that point to some extent. Right, you need a paragraph that really addresses kind of who they are, where they come from. We don't need a lot of information there. I thought you were going in that direction. But then you're getting something about Vinland here. You seem to shift from talking about who the Vikings were and where they come from to focusing on Vinland, okay, which I wasn't unsure why we did that shift. So before you talk about North America, you definitely need to talk about Scandinavia, and you need to define when the Vikings were active and where they came from and things like that, okay, which you can get from most of the books. So I've said here, what's the significance of this stuff about Vinland? Okay, I think we need to focus that discussion a bit more clearly. Now I can't even read my own handwriting now, which is I cannot really see how the location. Okay, we've got something to do with Vinland again here, and I couldn't make the connection between the location of Vinland and the issue of raiding and trading. So if you think there is some significance there, you need to explain that more clearly, I think. Okay. And okay, this is just, you said Vikings destroyed all manuscripts, monastic ruins, and Celtic Christianity came to an end in Ireland. That's an exaggeration, okay. They destroyed a lot of things, but they didn't destroy all of it, and things did continue. So you need to kind of reduce your comments there a bit. And yeah, and then as I said, consider the effects of the sources in what we say about the Vikings and so on. Okay. I better speed up because I've only got 10 minutes left or something like that. Burchin's not here. Hassan, what have I got to say to Hassan? Okay, another short one. So again, lots of work to be done in terms of substance and work and so on. What have I written at the end here? We need more about two things, I think. No, okay, we need to work on that then. There must be things, I don't know. If we haven't got resources, then obviously you can't kind of work on that. We may need to work out ways to shift things a little bit, okay? But even before we worry about that, I think you need to, hang on, I don't know whether it was Marta, okay, the two of you are both working on Richard, the Lionheart, as kind of crusader and so on. So it might be that one of you's got some books and the other one couldn't find them or something like that, I don't know. So you might want to talk to see who's got what or something. But you need to say a bit about, in general, his crusading ideas, why he went on crusade and so on, okay? And what were his reasons? Not just about Cyprus, but about general. What was this guy doing going on crusade? And then if and when you focus on Cyprus, if we can find the material, then you can look at what he does in Cyprus and how does that fit in to his overall kind of motivation and plans and things like that, okay? And we need, if we can find the resources, something about the actual events in Cyprus, what he was doing. And then, as I said, how does this fit into the overall crusading activity? But if you're having a problem with resources, the best thing is if you can send me an email, okay, very soon, and then maybe I can, when I'm in the library, I can go and dig around and see what I can find as well. And if we can't find anything, if it's because it's not there or because Marta has it or whatever it might be, then we might need to think of a different topic or something like that, okay? But that's related to this because you've done some work already, okay? Yes. Now we do have, this is one thing I was going to show you all at the end, but we do have this new search thing that we're using. You must have got an email about that a couple of days ago. We're testing it out. I'm not going to make any comments now because this will be broadcast to the world eventually, and the people who make the research engine don't want to, you know, show a video of me saying, this is excellent stuff, buy this for your children, and, or saying nasty things about it. But we're testing this for a few months. This is a simple sort of Google-style entry, but there's an advanced search option, and we're testing it, so we're going to see how effective it is. Or you can just go from here, you can just go to searching the journals or the databases directly, okay, one way or another. This is, in theory, accessing everything. And you might want to try a number of searches and things like that. Okay, speeding up. Okay, so Marta is here. Richard the Lionheart again. To be continued, it says. Okay, that's like what happens next or something when the end does programs. Oh, I wish it was another one. Except sometimes CNBCE, the Turkish channel that has the English stuff, they sometimes put like 2 half-hour episodes together, so you're not left... I'm kind of sad they don't seem to have Doctor Who on anymore, but anyway. Okay, again, Richard the Lionheart. Okay, more general thing you're hoping you're doing, rather than focusing, at least at the moment, on Cyprus. And what have I written here? Yes, in order to assess Richard's crusade, you need to, 1, think about... Okay, again, the same point. The general motivation... Oh, no, this is going even further beyond. General motivations for crusade. Why did people crusade? And, of course, you've got to think here, did people who crusaded in the first crusade, were their motivations similar or different to people who crusaded in the third crusade, which is what Richard was involved with, because obviously there's a whole history of crusading in between the two and so on. So why did people go on crusade? And there's a number of different reasons, and people were all were different for that. And how Richard's own reasons related to these, okay, and where does he fit in on that, okay? And yeah, I'll come back to that point in a minute. And secondly, look at the general actions and results of crusaders as well. So it's not just kind of people sitting at home saying, okay, I'm going to go on crusade because I'm very religious, or I don't like the Muslims, or whatever it might be, and off they go. But also then when they actually get there, what do these people do? What actually happens? Because then obviously people are constantly reacting to circumstances. And again, can we see Richard in that way or not? And finally, we have to distinguish between the kind of standard crusaders, the knights or whatever it might be, and people like Richard who are clearly very, very high profile. He's not intending to go there and stay there. he wants to come, he's always planned to come back, and other kings and significant noblemen, okay, they must have a certain perspective. So you might want to compare him to one or two other kings or something if you've got time, okay. But the main material is kind of fine, okay, so that's my comments. If anyone has problem reading my handwriting, you can scan it and send it to me, because I don't always succeed either. And Celtic Christianity, religion and so on, editor. What have I got? Again, I haven't scribbled a lot on the essay itself. I've got some comments at the end. Okay, I've said you need to think about Britain and Ireland to some extent separately. Okay, you need to see them to some extent as separate entities, though that's perhaps to some of an exaggeration. In Britain, Christianity spread to the Celts primarily as part of the Roman world. Okay. Even before Constantine was converted, you had people in Britain who were becoming Christian. And even before the Romans were properly Christian, you have St. Alban and others. So here you need to think a little bit more about how Christianity spread in the Roman Empire, and then Britain was part of that. Okay, Britannia. So not Scotland, but what is now England and Wales in different ways were part of that, and how Christianity spread as part of the Roman world. And there will be some books, I'm sure, in the library about kind of things about general things. In Ireland, Christianity spread to the Irish primarily by missionaries and some local saints. We talked about this. You can look at the videos to see me talking about it again, I suppose. Without the immediate support of a kind of political hierarchy. So once Constantine converts, or not once, but gradually, over time following his conversion, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, and Britain is part of the Roman Empire. So of course, Christianity is not just spreading person to person as an individual motivation, but also it's got the backing of the empire. Okay? In Ireland, not part of the Roman Empire, you've got people like St. Patrick coming in and so on, and others, no doubt, but he's become the big figure. So it's a very different kind of process. More comparable to what happens to the English later on. Okay, so for whatever reason, and I think this is one of the first ones I read, so I can't remember all the details now, but I must have felt that you need to kind of look at these two issues and see how they might be different or not. It's up to you to decide. And I've said here, think about spread rather than conversion. Yes, when we're talking about mass things, mass groups, large areas, we can think more in terms of the kind of gradual spread of something, moving along, and lots of people shifting, rather than kind of converting where we think more, at least for me anyway, I think, I've converted, I'm now a Jew or something like that, okay, suddenly. And obviously every spreading of a religion is lots of individual conversions, but use that word perhaps might be a good way of thinking about it as well. So we need to build on that, but the main, and this is kind of a lot of background here, so we need to work our way particularly into a bit more on the Roman stuff and into, I think, the early medieval period as well. Okay. Right, that's it. If I don't hear from any of you in the next few weeks, I definitely have to hear from you by that date. But please feel free to send me a mail, try and come and see me. From now on, I'll be mostly at the library, of course. If you've got any questions, or send me a mail, say, can I come and see you, or something like that, or can you help me with this question? Because obviously, you're going to be busy with lots of things at the moment, juggling all the things you've got to do. So any help I can give, I'm happy to do that as long as I've got time. Okay, so don't hesitate to contact me. Tamanna, okay? Right, thank you for listening to me for the past 3 months. And thank you for your presentations and so on. And thank you for coming. Not everyone is here, so I won't say thank you to them. Good luck with your essays, and Happy New Year.